In a forgotten corner of New Mexico, a broken cowboy spent his last dollar on a crippled horse. The townsfolk laughed until the mayor dragged him into the canyons, where buried gold and a century of lies waited. What began as pity turned into the greatest reckoning Silver Creek had ever faced, and the truth would cost more than anyone was ready to pay. The wind came off the desert carrying dust and the faint, metallic tang of old rain that never quite made it to the ground. Samuel Reed stood on the porch of his sagging cabin and watched it move across the flats like a ghost looking for a door. The boards under his boots had a long memory. They creaked where his late wife once paused to lift a kettle, where his son, small and laughing, had chased moths in the lamplight. The laugh was long gone. The moths kept their secrets. Silver Creek, New Mexico, wasn't much more than a bend in the two-lane and a handful of buildings huddled against the heat. A church with sun-faded paint. A diner that smelled like coffee and griddle grease from 50 yards out. A hardware store with a cracked bell that rang when the door stuck, which was most of the time. Beyond that, land, scarred and beautiful, as if the earth had been stitched back together by a hurried hand. Samuel knew every stitch. He had ridden its seams when he was young and sure, and when the world still answered to his voice. Now he spoke mostly to Rusty. Rusty was a one-eyed hound with a coat the color of old coins and a patience that made you believe in better angels. He lay at Samuel's feet, chin on paws, watching the horizon like a sentry who knew the enemy wasn't out there so much as inside time itself. They fit together, the man and the dog, two creatures who'd outlasted most of what had defined them. "Wind's turning," Samuel said, rubbing the scar on his forearm where a sorrel colt had once left him a memory. "Gonna bring grit into the cracks again." Rusty's ear ticked. Approval, maybe. Or just acknowledgement that sound still mattered. Inside the cabin, everything had its place because that's how you keep a small world from coming apart. The stove was clean, because even beans taste better when you respect the pot. The bed was narrow, the quilt patched in neat squares by hands Samuel still felt in the dark before sleep. On the far wall hung a faded photograph. A woman with steady eyes, a boy with his mother's mouth, a man who looked a little like the one on the porch, and a little like someone else entirely. Samuel looked at that picture each morning to measure the distance between his then and his now. He made coffee thick enough to slow thought and drank it on the steps while the day gathered itself. Morning at the edge of the desert comes like a reluctant favor. Light doesn't flood so much as seep, the color of pewter and old bone, until, all at once, the mesas catch fire and the sky remembers it knows how to be blue. Birds stitched quick, bright lines from fence post to fence post. A truck growled somewhere near the highway, then faded, leaving the quiet to resettle like dust. Work made the hours keep their shape. Fences needed mending even when no one asked. Saddles wore through where the past met the present, and Samuel's hands could give them another season. He carried the leather smell home with him, honest and simple, the way sweat can be a prayer when you don't have words for one. People in town knew him in the way you know a weathered sign on a back road. You pass it, you recognize it, you can't say exactly what it says anymore. At the diner, Mrs. Alvarez poured his coffee before he sat, like muscle memory. Sheriff Dean tipped his hat with the careful friendliness reserved for men who keep to themselves. Teenagers stared because solitude is a thing you can't understand until it fits your shoulders. Everyone had a version of Samuel Reed. None of them were wrong, exactly. and none of them were true enough. He walked the aisles of the hardware store that afternoon, touching boxes of nails, feeling their small, reliable weight through the cardboard. Old Man Tate leaned on the counter, glasses down his nose, radio murmuring a country song that played every hour because time in Silver Creek made circles, not arrows. "You hear about the auction tomorrow?" Tate asked, without looking up. Samuel nodded. The McCrae place. 40 acres of stubborn soil and a barn that always seemed one gust away from deciding it had given enough. Mr. McCrae had been good with horses and bad with money, an equation the land never solved for long. A fever took him in spring, and since then the bank had printed notices that curled in the heat and came loose from posts until Martha from the store stapled them back with a sigh that sounded like the end of something. "They're selling everything," Tate said. "Tools, a generator that runs if you talk nice to it, a couple saddles, even the stock. Shame of it." "Shame?" Samuel agreed. He sifted a handful of roofing tacks, let them drop like metallic rain. "You going?" "I'll stand around and make a fool of myself like everybody else." Tate finally looked up, one eyebrow raised. "You bidding on anything, Sam?" "Don't imagine so." "Good," Tate grinned. "Means I might get something cheap." On the way out, Samuel paused at the bulletin board where paper dreams went to curl and yellow. There were the usual notices: church bake sale, youth softball, a guitar teacher offering lessons in patience more than music. In the corner was a photo someone had tacked up of a long-ago rodeo. A horse, mid-buck, a man flying, dirt lifting in a reverent halo. Samuel didn't remember the picture being taken. He remembered the air. It had tasted like tin and adrenaline. It had carried the sweet-sour smell of horse and fear. He remembered the split second when everything held its breath. The crowd, the sky, the man. And then the ground had come up, hard and certain, and the world had asked what he had left. He walked home slowly, letting the heat press its hand to the small of his back. Along the ditch, cottonwoods shook their leaves like coins in a loose pocket. The creek that named the town ran thin in August. It sang quietly to itself in a language of stones. Rusty trotted ahead, and then back again, practicing the art of staying near without getting underfoot. At the fence line, a jackrabbit exploded from stillness, and Rusty gave a half-hearted chase for the memory of it. In the yard, Samuel tightened a hinge on the lean-to where he kept leather scraps and the tools whose handles remembered the shape of his grip. He traced the edge of a half-finished saddle seat, oak-tanned, solid, then set it aside. The day didn't ask for finishing. It asked for steady. Late light made the desert honest. It flattened pretense, pulled long shadows out of everything, and laid them down where you could see them. Samuel brewed a second pot of coffee, then changed his mind and left it to cool. On the porch, he rolled a cigarette he might not smoke and listened to the land say its quiet piece. Coyotes tuned up somewhere beyond the ridge. A pickup door slammed. Far to the south, thunder muttered to itself as if working out an old grievance. When the first star showed, small and brave, he went inside and lifted the picture off the wall. He didn't do it every night. He did it when the day left him with more questions than answers, which was more often than he admitted. The glass caught the lamplight, and his face ghosted over the three of them, past and present layering like thin vellum. "I'm still here," he told them, a promise and a confession. He set the frame back in its space, precise as a ritual, and checked the latch on the door out of habit, not fear. Rusty circled twice and chose a place under the window where he could watch the moon write slow letters across the floor. Samuel lay down and counted boards instead of sheep, because numbers that led nowhere comforted him more than one's pretending to arrive someplace. Sleep, when it came, was the kind that kept one eye open. He dreamed of hooves, not the thunder of a herd, not the bright clatter of a parade day, but a deliberate, uneven rhythm. Tap, drag, tap, drag, that felt like a message or a memory. In the dream, dust rose in a thin column, as if the earth were exhaling one long-held breath. The column bent toward him like a person trying to be heard over the hush. He woke before dawn, the air cool on his face, the sheet twisted. Rusty lifted his head and whuffed softly, the way dogs talk in their sleep. Outside, the world was the color of old pewter again, the kind of morning that made you itch to move, even if you didn't know where to put your feet. Coffee. Water for Rusty. A glance to the east, where the sky was tying on its bandana of light. Samuel shrugged into his denim shirt and brushed the dust from his hat with a palm as calloused as the land. He stepped out onto the porch and stood very still. Some mornings are just mornings. Others feel like a door standing slightly open. Down along the fence, something shifted. Not the wind, not a rabbit or a coyote or the slow wander of a stray cow. Something taller, patient, as if the night had decided to leave behind a question mark. Samuel squinted through the gray. A shape took shape. Narrow-hipped, long-necked, a silhouette written in old stories. A horse stood beyond his gate, ribs faint under hide, one front leg set carefully as if the ground might bruise it. The animal lifted its head and breathed in his direction, slow and thoughtful, as if scent could be a kind of introduction. "Morning," Samuel said to the stranger, voice low so as not to startle whatever chance had sent here. The horse didn't spook. Its ears flicked, one toward him, one toward the highway, and then it looked past him, over the cabin, toward the red backs of the mesas, waiting to catch the first light. Rusty came to stand beside Samuel, shoulder warm against his shin. The dog didn't growl. He tilted his one good eye as if studying a visitor who might be kin. "Lost?" Samuel asked, because it's good manners to ask the obvious before you start guessing at fate. The horse shifted weight, that careful foreleg easing and setting again, as if answering yes, no, yes. Up close now, Samuel could see a small white blaze on the animal's forehead. Not neat, not proud, more like a thumbprint smudged into the fur by a hurried hand. Scar tissue traced the tendon above the hoof. An old injury healed the way time heals. Enough, but not without a cost. A rope hung from the gate post where Samuel kept it, because on a ranch, even a small, stubborn one, you try to be ready. He took it slow, hand open, speaking nonsense in a tone that made sense. "Easy now. Nothing in a hurry here. We can take this one step at a time." The horse didn't back away. It didn't reach toward him either. It waited. In the pause between their breathing, something settled. The sun struck the far rim of the mesa then, a clean knife of light, and the desert lit like a lantern. The horse blinked, new day spilling over its face, then turned its head to look once more toward the red rock country, the way a person looks toward a town where they left one last errand undone, Behind the animal, at the far end of the road, a strip of dust lifted where the highway cut through. Samuel heard finally what the wind had been carrying toward him for the past day. The talk of people about an auction, and of the things they would take home that did not belong to them yet. He hadn't planned to go. He didn't plan much of anything anymore. But life has a way of placing a marker in your yard and asking whether you will ignore it. Samuel scratched Rusty's ear. "Reckon we'll have a look," he said, and the words surprised him not because he'd spoken them, but because of the small, bright pulse of interest they sparked in his chest. He hadn't felt that in a while. He hadn't missed it because he'd told himself there wasn't room for it. Turns out there was room, if you were willing to move something else aside. The rope made a soft whisper as he looped it in his palm. The horse watched, measuring him in the unhurried way of a creature who has learned patience the hard way. "If you're meant to be somewhere," Samuel said, "we'll see if we can get you there." The horse stepped forward, not a full stride, more like a decision. By the time the sun cleared the mesa, the desert had set the day in motion. Out on the two-lane, a pickup headed toward town with a trailer rattling behind it. Somewhere, a bell would ring too hard because the door stuck. Somewhere, flyers about an auction would lift and settle and lift again, waiting for hands to tear them down when the business was done. Samuel tied the gate, checked the latch twice out of habit, and stood for another breath beside the horse that had appeared like a thought. He didn't know its name. He didn't know its story. He knew only the good weight of the rope in his hand, and the sound of Rusty's steady breathing, and the particular way the morning felt like the beginning of something he had not ordered and could not send back. "Come on then," he said. "Let's go see what the day wants." The three of them, man, dog, horse, stepped into the thin road where tire dust rose to meet them, and Silver Creek, not yet awake enough to object, let them pass. The noon sun came down like it was trying to hammer the world flat. Heat shimmered on the dirt road leading into Silver Creek, and the air itself seemed to hum with it. Samuel Reed walked slow, his boots lifting little puffs of red dust, Rusty padding at his side. He hadn't meant to be here. Truth be told, he hadn't meant to be anywhere outside his cabin that day. But the shape of that horse at his gate the night before lingered in his mind, and something in him had stirred. The auction yard was already alive with voices when he arrived. The McCrae farm had been stripped bare, each piece of a man's life now tagged with chalk and offered to the highest bidder. A wagon sat on blocks, wheels leaning tiredly like old shoulders, ropes coiled stiff from sun and neglect, saddles whose leather had seen better days, lined up like retired soldiers waiting to be chosen again. The smell of sweat, horses, and dust was thick enough to taste. Families clustered in small groups, hats tipped against the glare. Children ran between legs, kicking up more dust and earning sharp calls from their mothers. Men with sunburned necks leaned on fence rails, squinting at livestock with the practiced eye of people who measured worth by muscle and bone. Laughter came in quick bursts, brittle around the edges, as if everyone knew they were circling someone else's misfortune and trying not to feel the weight of it. The auctioneer, a broad man with a face burned red as a branding iron, stood on a platform and shouted over the crowd. His voice carried the cadence of someone who had learned to sell rain to thirsty men. He held up tools, pots, even a box of mason jars, and the bidding started low, climbed, and fell off again. Samuel kept to the edge, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. He wasn't here to buy, not really. He told himself he came for the walk, for the sight of people moving about in a world he used to claim. But when the first horse was led out, his heart gave a little kick he hadn't prepared for. There were 6 in all. A chestnut gelding with good shoulders that would fetch decent money, a gray mare heavy with foal, a mule broad across the back, the kind that could drag a plow until sunset without complaint. One by one they were led past the crowd, each animal assessed in quick, mercantile glances. Then came the last. A sorrel mare, ribs showing, coat dull as if dust had settled under the skin itself. She carried her head high, though, and in her dark eyes burned a quiet defiance. Her left foreleg dragged slightly with each step, an old injury that made the crowd shift uncomfortably. Everyone saw the limp and stopped seeing anything else. The auctioneer's voice faltered for the first time. "Now here we got a mare, gentle enough, but you can see her condition. She ain't gonna win no races, folks. Might do light work, might teach the young'uns to sit a saddle." His words hung in the heat, like a half-hearted apology. Silence followed. The mare stamped once, as if insulted, and the sound echoed in Samuel's bones. He watched her shift weight, saw the way she favored the good leg, yet still kept her neck arched proud. There was history in that posture, not just pain, memory. 50 cents, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 50 cents? No answer. 40, then? 30? He laughed awkwardly, wiping sweat from his brow. Surely somebody's got a use for her. But the crowd looked away. Children tugged at skirts. Men scuffed boots in dust, pretending to study the horizon. No one wanted to claim weakness in horseflesh. Samuel's throat tightened. He could hear Rusty panting at his feet, the steady rasp of a dog who had been dismissed once himself, but had endured. He remembered the way the horse had appeared at his gate, steady in the gray dawn, as if she had chosen him already. $1. The words came out louder than he meant. The crowd turned, startled. Conversations hushed. Samuel felt all those eyes on him, weighing his foolishness. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned like a man who'd been handed reprieve. "Well now, we've got a bid." $1. Do I hear 125? Nothing. Going once, going twice. The gavel cracked against wood. Sold to Mr. Reed for $1. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel so much as uneasy. People shook their heads, muttered about waste, a man spending his last. Coin on a lame horse was a story they would carry back to their supper tables. Samuel ignored them. He stepped forward slow, hand open, hat tilted back. The mare's ears flicked toward him, then away. She breathed out once, a sound low and almost human. When he touched her neck, the tension in her body eased, just a fraction, and she leaned into his palm like someone remembering trust. "What's her name?" Martha, the storekeeper, had appeared beside him, her apron dusted with flour. She had known Samuel longer than most, had seen him when his family was still alive, and when the world had collapsed into silence after. "Don't know yet," Samuel said. Martha studied him, her expression soft but worried. "You sure about this?" Another mouth to feed. Sam. He kept stroking the mare's neck, feeling the warmth under her battered coat. Sometimes a man don't know what he needs until it's standing right in front of him. Martha's eyes glistened for just a moment before she turned away, pretending to scold a boy running past. Samuel led the mare through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers followed. Rusty trotted faithfully beside them, tail low but steady. Together they made a strange procession, a weathered man, a battered horse, and a dog that had seen too much. The walk back to his cabin took longer than usual. The mare limped but kept pace, her ears twitching toward sounds only she seemed to notice. The road shimmered in heat, and behind them the auction yard dissolved into dust and distant voices. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun was sliding west. Shadows stretched long across the yard. Samuel opened the gate to the small corral he'd mended a dozen times over the years. The posts leaned, the rails groaned, but it would hold. He slipped the rope free and stepped back. The mare turned, fixing him with those dark eyes again, and for a heartbeat Samuel felt something pass between them. Not gratitude, not fear, something older, as if she carried a story he had yet to hear. "Grace," he said softly, the name choosing itself. The mare flicked her tail and lowered her head to the hay, as if she'd been waiting all along. Samuel leaned on the fence, watching the evening settle around them. The world still held its sorrows, but for the first time in years, it also held a question. What if there was more left for him than silence? Rusty nudged his hand, demanding attention. Samuel scratched the dog's ears, eyes never leaving Grace. In the fading light, the mare shifted and stamped once, her gaze drifting east toward the red canyons. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but Samuel felt the weight of it in his bones. Night in Silver Creek carried a silence that wasn't quite silence at all. Crickets stitched the dark with their steady rhythm. Coyotes tuned in from far hills, and every now and then the boards of Samuel Reed's cabin let out a weary sigh. He sat on his porch with Rusty curled at his feet, the lantern glow spilling a circle that barely pushed back the shadows. Out in the corral, the new mare moved restlessly, her uneven hoofbeats tapping out a pattern that set Samuel's teeth on edge. He had named her Grace, though the word still felt tentative on his tongue, as if names had to earn their place the way people did. Grace paced the rail, pausing to stare east, where the dark canyons cut blacker shapes into the horizon. The injured leg kept her from moving easily, but she didn't seem to mind the ache. It was purpose that drove her, not comfort. Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and watched her with the same wary attention he might give a storm cloud building on the mesa. "Settle now," he murmured, voice carrying across the yard. "Ain't nothing out there but stone and dust." But Grace only tossed her head, the blaze on her forehead catching what little light there was, and Samuel felt the hollowness in his chest shift. He hadn't wanted to care. He'd told himself he was simply keeping another stray from being discarded. Yet something about the horse unsettled him, the way her eyes didn't just look at things. They weighed them, as if she carried knowledge older than his own scars. The night grew colder. Samuel lit his pipe, the smell of tobacco drifting sharp and sweet, and Rusty let out a low growl, the dog's single eye fixed on the corral. Grace had stopped pacing. She stood still, ears pricked, body tense, staring east, as if waiting for a signal no human could hear. The hair on Samuel's arms rose. He tamped the pipe out and stood, hand hovering near the old rifle propped against the doorframe. Nothing moved beyond the fence, but wind stirring the cottonwoods. By morning, Grace was still at it. Samuel woke to find her standing at the far edge of the corral, head high, ears angled toward the canyons. She hadn't touched the hay he left, and her sides heaved as though she had traveled miles in her mind. Rusty whined when Samuel stepped outside, circling the mare's gaze but never daring to bark. Samuel rubbed the sleep from his eyes and studied the animal in the pale light. "Stubborn fool," he muttered, though the words carried more admiration than frustration. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you're waiting on me." He poured coffee, the kind that bit at the tongue and carried the cup to the fence. Grace turned toward him then, and for the first time since he brought her home, he saw something soften in her stance. She limped over, slow but deliberate, and pressed her muzzle against the rough wood. Samuel reached a hand across and touched her cheek, the fur coarse beneath his fingers. She leaned into it, eyes closing for a heartbeat, then pulled away with a sharp snort as if to remind him this was no surrender, only an agreement. The day wore on with odd interruptions. Whenever Samuel turned his back, Grace stamped or tossed her head until he returned his gaze to her. At noon, while repairing a hinge, he caught sight of her circling the corral, moving in tighter and tighter loops until she stopped and pawed at the dirt. He walked over to check, finding nothing but dry soil and a few stones, yet Grace seemed unsatisfied. She blew hard through her nostrils and swung her head east again. Neighbors stopped by that afternoon, word of his purchase traveling faster than a prairie fire. Old men shook their heads, offering sympathy disguised as jokes. "$1's a fair price for bones," one said. Children pressed their faces to the fence, pointing at Grace and giggling. Martha from the store brought bread wrapped in a towel and gave him the look of someone who wanted to argue, but knew it would do no good. "She's not just lame, Sam," Martha said softly, as they stood by the gate. "She's haunted." "You can see it in her eyes," Samuel didn't answer. He only watched Grace, who stood with ears pricked, staring at Martha with a calm so intense it silenced the children's laughter. Even Martha fell quiet, shifting uncomfortably before pressing the bread into Samuel's hand and leaving with a quick goodbye. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Samuel lay listening to Grace's uneven steps in the corral, the scrape of hoof against dirt, the occasional restless whinny that cut through the dark. Rusty climbed onto the bed, something he rarely did anymore, and pressed close as if bracing against a storm. Samuel stared at the ceiling, the memory of Grace's eyes burning in his mind. They weren't the eyes of an animal resigned to weakness. They were the eyes of something waiting for the right moment. Toward dawn, he drifted into uneasy dreams. He saw canyons flooded with gold light, rocks carved with symbols he didn't understand, and the sound of hooves echoing like a drumbeat calling him forward. When he woke, sweat dampened his shirt, and Rusty was pacing the room, nails clicking on the wood floor. Outside, Grace stood at the gate, her body taut with expectation. She bobbed her head once, sharp and certain. Samuel set down his cup of cold coffee, heart thudding in his chest. He had lived 60 years by trusting instincts sharpened on battlefields and backcountry trails. And every bone in his body told him this horse was asking for more than hay or shelter. She was asking to be followed. He stepped onto the porch, boots crunching in the dirt. Grace pawed the ground, her breath rising in clouds against the morning chill. Rusty whined low in his throat, sensing the shift in the air. Samuel tightened his belt, reached for his hat, and muttered to himself, "You're a damn fool, Reed." But he opened the gate anyway. Grace moved forward, not away from him, but past him, toward the narrow trail that wound into the red country. She limped, yes, but with purpose, each step a declaration. Samuel fell in behind her, Rusty at his heels, and together they left the cabin behind. The first rays of sun caught the mesa tops, painting them in fire, and Samuel realized his quiet life had tilted. The horse he had bought for $1 was no burden. She was a compass. And wherever she meant to lead him, he no longer had the strength, or perhaps the desire, to turn back. The morning air clung cool against Samuel's skin as he followed Grace away from the small cabin and into the open country. Rusty padded at his side, tongue lolling, tail held low, as though even the old hound understood they were crossing into something beyond ordinary. The trail began as a simple cattle path, cut shallow into the earth by hooves long gone, but Grace moved with a certainty that unsettled Samuel. Her limp slowed her pace, but never her direction. She walked as though each stone and bend of sagebrush had been memorized years before. The red rock canyons loomed on the horizon, their jagged backs catching the early light. They looked like giant altars, carved by wind and time, stained with secrets. Samuel's boots crunched on gravel, the sound swallowed quickly by the vast quiet. It was a silence that pressed against his chest, filled with weight. He had traveled these parts before, back when his back was straight and his voice carried more hope than smoke. Yet he couldn't recall ever being drawn this far east without a reason, and now he was being led by a horse bought for $1. "Damn fool," he muttered under his breath. But he didn't stop. Hours stretched, the desert offering no shade, only the sharp scent of juniper and the rustle of dry grass. Grace climbed a ridge, favoring her bad leg but never faltering, and Samuel followed, sweat already streaking down his temples. Rusty trotted ahead, stopped to sniff at jackrabbit burrows, then returned, restless. The dog's ears pricked, uneasy, as though the canyon wind carried something older than prey or predator. At the ridgetop, Grace paused. She lifted her head, ears forward, nostrils flaring wide, as if she could drink in the landscape. Samuel rested a hand on his hip, breathing hard. Before them stretched a narrow gorge, hidden between shoulders of sandstone. The opening was barely wide enough for a horse, half concealed by fallen boulders. Grace stepped toward it with no hesitation, hooves knocking pebbles loose, her shadow thrown long across the stone. Samuel swore softly. He had ridden with scouts during campaigns in rougher terrain, and he knew the kind of country that swallowed men whole. Yet there was no question in Grace's movement. She threaded through the opening, her limp pronounced on the uneven ground, but her pace steady as prayer. The gorge opened into a hollow canyon floor, wide enough for 20 men to camp. Cottonwoods grew near a shallow spring that seeped from the rock face, and the air felt cooler, as though the canyon itself had preserved a pocket of mercy. But Samuel's eyes weren't on the trees or the water. They followed Grace as she crossed the clearing and stopped at a patch of earth, darker than the rest, as though shadow clung there even in full daylight. She pawed at the ground, striking the soil with her good hoof, then stepped back and fixed Samuel with that gaze again. Dark, intelligent, unsettling. Samuel felt the weight of her expectation. He set down his pack, knelt, and began to scrape at the ground with his hands. The earth came loose easier than it should have, as though it had once been disturbed and hastily covered. Stones shifted, dirt gave way, and his fingers struck something solid. Metal. His breath hitched. He dug faster, pulling away clumps of soil until the outline of a box emerged. A strong box. Iron-banded, scarred by time, but intact. The lock was rusted through, brittle as bone. Samuel rocked back on his heels, staring at the thing like it might bite. "What in God's name?" His voice came rough. Rusty circled the box, whining low. Grace lowered her head, snorted once, and then turned to drink from the spring, as though her task was done. Samuel reached for a stone and struck the lock. It crumbled under the blow, falling in flakes of rust. The lid lifted with a groan, and the canyon filled with a glint that made Samuel's heart pound. Gold coins, stacked in neat rolls, their surfaces catching fire from the sun overhead. He froze, unable to move or breathe. The fortune inside the box was more than he had seen in his entire lifetime, more than his father's land had ever yielded, more than any honest man could hold without it changing him. His calloused fingers touched a coin, cold and heavy, stamped with dates from decades past. But it wasn't only coins. Nestled among the stacks was a book, its leather cover cracked, pages yellowed with age. Samuel lifted it carefully, brushing away dirt. The writing inside was cramped but legible, entries made in a steady hand. He read a few lines and felt his stomach twist. References to bank shipments, ambushes, names he recognized from the stories whispered around Silver Creek about robberies no one had ever solved. The canyon seemed to lean closer, listening. The wind died. Samuel closed the book and shoved it back into the box. His pulse hammered in his ears. He looked to Grace, who drank calmly from the spring as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The mare lifted her head, water dripping from her muzzle, and met his eyes. There was no accident in her leading him here. He felt it in his marrow. She had known. Somehow, she had carried this secret for years. Maybe for generations, waiting for someone to follow. Samuel stood slowly, dirt caked under his nails, sweat drying cold against his back. He wanted to believe he was free to walk away, to bury the box again and let the canyon keep its silence. But Grace pawed the earth once more, snorting impatiently, and Samuel understood the truth. The discovery was not a gift. It was a burden. Rusty barked once, sharp and anxious, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls. Samuel flinched. He thought of the townspeople, of their hunger for stories, and their sharper hunger for wealth. He thought of Richard Blackwell, banker and politician, whose family name had always clung to rumors. "Lord help me," Samuel whispered. He heaved the strongbox from the hole, muscles straining. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that would mark a man forever. He closed the lid, tied it with rope from his pack, and lifted it onto his shoulder. Grace watched, ears flicking back and forth. Rusty growled at the shadows, as though already aware that secrets once unearthed had a way of drawing predators. The three of them made their way back through the narrow gorge, Samuel staggering under the load, Grace limping steadily ahead, Rusty circling protectively. The sky above had shifted to a harder blue, and the air smelled sharper, like iron before a storm. When they reached the ridge, Samuel turned for one last look at the canyon. The cottonwoods swayed as if whispering, and he could almost hear words in the leaves. Nothing stays buried forever. By the time they reached the cabin again, the sun was low, shadows stretching across the yard. Samuel set the box on his rough-hewn table beside the worn Bible that had belonged to his father. Gold and scripture side by side, the weight of two different kinds of truth. Grace stood at the fence, her dark eyes still fixed on him. She gave a low whinny, soft and almost mournful, then turned east once more, ears pricked toward the canyons as though reminding him this was only the beginning. Samuel sank into his chair, chest heaving. Rusty lay at his boots, restless. The strongbox gleamed in the fading light, each coin a small sun. Samuel rubbed his face with both hands, exhausted. He knew, with a clarity that shook him, that life would never return to what it had been the morning before. Grace had carried him into the canyons and shown him something he wasn't meant to see, or perhaps something he had been chosen to see. And choices, he realized, would come faster than he was ready for. The strongbox sat on Samuel Reed's table like a coiled animal, its presence altering the air inside the cabin. The lamplight caught the edges of the coins within, and they gleamed with a fire that seemed both beautiful and accusatory. Samuel poured himself coffee, though his hands shook, sloshing some across the wooden boards. Rusty paced the floor, nails clicking a restless rhythm, while Grace shifted uneasily in the corral outside, her hoofbeats punctuating the silence like an impatient drum. Samuel pulled the cracked leather journal from the box, turning it over in his hands. The cover was stiff, scarred by time, and when he opened it, the smell of old ink and dust rose like a whisper from the grave. The writing inside was cramped and careful, each line pressed deep into the page as though the man who wrote it had been desperate to ensure he was heard. The first entry stopped him cold. It mentioned a shipment, gold coins bound, for banks across the territory, guarded by lawmen who never made it home. Samuel leaned closer, the lamplight trembling across the faded script. The words named places he knew: Santa Fe, Albuquerque, even Silver Creek. His gut tightened. He had grown up hearing the stories of robberies on lonely trails, of men who vanished into the red country with wagons heavy from blood and fortune. None had ever been solved. As he read further, the entries grew darker. Names appeared. Outlaws long dead, lawmen betrayed, and one name that caught his breath: Jebediah Blackwell. The handwriting described him not as a respectable banker's ancestor, but as a calculating thief, a man who used his position in finance to plan robberies, feeding information to gangs, while keeping his hands outwardly clean. Samuel shut the journal with a snap, his pulse loud in his ears. He sat back, staring at the strongbox. The discovery was no mere treasure. It was evidence, heavy with accusation, carrying the kind of truth that could unravel the foundations of Silver Creek itself. He thought of Richard Blackwell, the current banker, whose handshake was always just a little too firm, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. The family had owned the land around town for decades, their influence woven into every debt and deed. If this journal was right, their fortune had been built on theft and death. Rusty whined, pressing against Samuel's leg. He rubbed the dog's ear absent-mindedly, eyes fixed on the box. "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" he asked the room. Outside, Grace whinnied, low and insistent. Samuel rose, carrying the journal with him, and stepped out into the night. The stars had burned through the black sky, cold and sharp, and the horse stood at the edge of the corral, ears pricked east again. She tossed her head when he approached, snorted as if scolding him for sitting too long with doubts. "You brought me to it," he said, holding the journal where she could see. "You knew." Grace stamped her good hoof once, a sound that echoed through the yard. For a moment, Samuel felt the line between man and beast blur. She was not merely reacting, but communicating, pressing him forward toward something larger than his solitude. The following morning, Samuel carried the journal into town. He needed perspective, and there were few in Silver Creek he trusted. He walked to the diner first, where the smell of bacon and coffee wrapped around him like memory. Mrs. Alvarez greeted him with a nod, but the conversations hushed slightly when he entered, eyes following the man who'd spent his last dollar on a broken horse. He ate quickly, ignoring the whispers, then stepped back into the glare of the day. Instead of turning home, he found his boots carrying him toward the old library room tucked behind the church. Miss Clara Dawson, the schoolteacher, was inside, cataloging a stack of donated books. She looked up, surprised. "Mr. Reed," she said. "I can't recall the last time I saw you here." Samuel cleared his throat, awkward. "Looking for something old. Records, maybe. About robberies. Banking." Her brow furrowed. "That's a peculiar request." "Any reason?" He hesitated, fingers tightening on the journal inside his coat. Clara was known for her honesty, for standing up to men twice her size during town meetings. If there was anyone who might help him untangle the storm he'd stepped into, it was her. But showing her the journal meant trusting her with a secret that could cost them both. Before he could answer, the door creaked open and Sheriff Dean Porter stepped in, tipping his hat. "Morning, Sam." Miss Dawson. His pale eyes lingered on Samuel longer than courtesy required. "Heard you were at the auction yesterday. Folks say you bought yourself a lame horse." His smile was thin. "Interesting choice." Samuel shifted, heat crawling the back of his neck. "Didn't figure it was anyone else's concern." "Maybe not." The sheriff's gaze dropped briefly to Samuel's coat where the journal bulged, then back up. "But sometimes choices have consequences." He tipped his hat again and left, boots echoing on the porch. Clara watched the door close, then turned back to Samuel, her expression sharper. "What are you carrying?" Samuel drew the journal slowly, setting it on the table between them. Clara opened it, scanning the brittle pages, and her lips parted as she read. This could change everything." Her voice trembled with both awe and fear. "If it's true, if this is what it looks like, the Blackwell family has lived off blood money for generations." Samuel nodded grimly. "Grace led me to it, dug me straight into the past." Clara looked up, eyes wide. "Then you've stepped into something you can't walk away from." "And neither can I." The bell of the church rang outside, calling the faithful to midday prayer. But inside that dusty library, Samuel Reed felt the weight of something larger than faith pressing down on him. The journal was more than paper. It was a ghost, of crimes unresolved, of voices silenced, demanding to be heard. Grace had uncovered a story buried in stone. Now it lived in his hands, and he knew it would not let him rest. The following nights carried no peace. Samuel Reed lay in bed, listening to the timbers of his cabin creak, to Rusty's low growls whenever the dog caught a scent on the wind, and to the restless shifting of Grace in the corral. Sleep came shallow, broken by the weight of the journal and the strongbox that now lived under his roof. He had hidden the box beneath loose floorboards, but the truth of it seemed to glow through the wood, a presence that could not be concealed. On the third evening, as dusk bled into the hills, Samuel stepped onto his porch with his rifle across his knees. He had not done this since his soldiering days, sitting watch, listening for movement in the dark. The Sahum, desert usually filled with familiar nighttime music, seemed too quiet. Then Rusty stiffened beside him, hackles raised, one eye fixed on the tree line. Samuel followed the dog's gaze and saw it, A glimmer of light, the brief flare of a match. Someone was watching from the brush. He stayed motionless, waiting. Whoever it was had the sense not to move again, but Samuel knew better than to doubt his eyes. Silver Creek wasn't the sort of town where strangers hid in shadows without reason. And he could think of only one reason now: the strongbox. The next morning he walked into town, the journal heavy under his coat. Conversation stopped when he passed. Some of it was old habit. Folks had long considered him an oddity. But there was something sharper now. Something expectant. At the general store, Martha pulled him aside and lowered her voice. "You've stirred something, Sam. People are talking. Some say you found more than a horse out there." He tried to brush it off, but Martha's eyes searched his face, and he saw worry there. She leaned closer. "Be careful who you trust. The Blackwell name still commands fear." Samuel nodded, carrying her warning with him as he left. When he returned home, the unease grew. Grace stood tense in the corral, ears swiveling constantly toward the ridge, nostrils flared. Rusty prowled the yard instead of lying in the shade, his nose low to the ground. Samuel checked the floorboards where the strongbox lay hidden and felt the chill of realization. Someone had been inside. A chair was nudged an inch from its place, a nail jar shifted on the shelf. Nothing was missing, but the subtle rearrangements shouted louder than theft. That night, smoke drifted across the yard. Samuel rushed outside, rifle ready, to find the old haystack at the back of the corral smoldering. He beat the fire out with a blanket, coughing from the acrid stench. Grace stamped and whinnied, wild-eyed from the flames, while Rusty barked furiously at the darkness beyond the fence. The fire had been no accident. It was a warning. He sat on the porch until dawn, rifle across his lap, the journal open beside him. He read by lantern light to keep his mind steady. One entry described a wagon ambush not far from Silver Creek, a crime never solved, though whispers had lived in the town for decades. The journal noted that Jebediah Blackwell himself had overseen the spoils. Samuel's jaw tightened. The Blackwell Empire, from its grand house to its sprawling ranch lands, had roots tangled in blood and gold. When daylight came, Clara Dawson appeared at the gate, dust on her skirts from the walk out of town. "I heard about the fire," she said, concern etched on her face. "Sam, you're being pushed. They want you to feel cornered." He gestured to the journal. "This proves too much. They'll come harder now." Clara's eyes hardened. "Then we can't face this alone. If the Blackwells built their fortune on murder, people deserve to." "No." Her resolve gave him pause. Samuel had carried his burdens alone for so long that the idea of sharing one felt foreign. But Clara's gaze was steady, as unwavering as Grace's when she pointed him toward the canyon. Against his instincts, Samuel felt a flicker of trust. That evening, he took a long walk along the ridge, rifle slung, Rusty at his heel. In the fading light, he found tracks, hoof prints that did not belong to Grace. Fresh. Too fresh. Someone had been close, circling his land. He crouched, fingers brushing the print, and his stomach clenched. Whoever watched him was no drifter passing through. They were deliberate, patient, and skilled. He rose slowly, eyes scanning the horizon. Beyond the ridge, the Blackwell Ranch stretched like a kingdom, its fences straight, its herds fat, its barns painted new each year. Samuel felt the journal's words burning in his pocket and understood the shape of his enemy more clearly now. As he returned home, the first coyote howls rose, carrying across the valley. Grace stood at the fence, waiting, her eyes catching what little light remained. She shifted her weight and stamped once, as if reminding him the fight had already begun. Samuel lifted the rifle, checked the chamber, and sat again on the porch. The land around him was no longer just wilderness. It was battlefield. And though he had not chosen it, the watching eyes had made certain he could no longer turn away. Clara Dawson had lived in Silver Creek for 3 years, long enough for the town to measure her with careful eyes, and longer still to realize she wasn't leaving. She had arrived with little more than a trunk of books, a weathered fiddle, and a determination that surprised people who thought a woman alone could not last in a place where summers scalded and winters gnawed bone deep. She took the teaching post in the one-room schoolhouse, patched the roof with her own hands, and kept her students fed with cornbread baked from flour she bought on credit, until parents learned to trust her. Samuel Reed had noticed her, though he seldom admitted it. On his rare visits into town, he'd seen her walking with children gathered around like ducklings, or standing on the porch of the school with chalk dust smudged on her skirt. She carried herself with quiet defiance, a woman who had learned early that kindness and strength weren't separate virtues, but threads that held each other together. He had respected her from a distance, content to remain a ghost on the edges of her life. Now, with the journal weighing heavy in his pocket and the strong box hidden under his floorboards, she was standing in his yard. Grace lifted her head when Clara approached the gate. The mare snorted once, then fell uncharacteristically calm, as though she recognized something in the school teacher. Rusty, always wary of strangers, gave a single bark, but soon wagged his tail, circling Clara's boots like an old friend. Samuel watched, unsettled by how quickly both animals accepted her. "I had to come," Clara said, brushing dust from her sleeves. "The sheriff's men have been asking questions." "They say you've been seen carrying something out of the canyons. I thought you should know." Samuel tightened his jaw. "They've been watching me for days. I reckon they already know more than I'd like." Clara's gaze sharpened. "And do they know what you found?" He hesitated, then pulled the journal from his coat and set it on the porch rail. She opened it without fear, flipping through brittle pages with a reverence that bordered on awe. Her lips moved silently as she read, and when she looked up, her face had paled. "This isn't just history," she whispered. "This is testimony." This proves what families like mine always suspected, that the Blackwells didn't build their wealth on honest work. Samuel studied her. "Your family?" Clara nodded. "My great-grandfather owned a small ranch outside Las Cruces. He borrowed from a bank connected to the Blackwells. After one of those robberies, he lost everything. We grew up on stories of betrayal, of debts that were never meant to be repaid. My father said the Blackwell name was cursed with stolen blood. Reading this," she tapped the journal with trembling fingers, "is like hearing his voice again." The confession in her tone struck Samuel harder than any accusation. Until now, the journal had been weight and suspicion. In Clara's hands, it became bloodline, memory, a wound still unhealed. He poured her coffee from the pot on his stove. They sat together on the porch steps, the desert opening before them, silent except for Grace shifting in the corral, and Rusty sighing at their feet. Samuel explained what had happened. Grace leading him into the canyon, the unearthed strongbox, the fire set near his corral. Clara listened without interrupting, though her knuckles whitened around the cup. When he finished, she spoke carefully. "If you think this will stay quiet, you're wrong. The Blackwells won't allow anyone to threaten their legacy. Richard is ruthless. If this journal reaches the wrong hands, you won't be the only one in danger. But if it reaches the right ones—" She trailed off, eyes searching the horizon as if weighing the scale of risk and justice. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "I spent my life fixing what's broken. Saddles, fences, the odd machine. But this," he gestured toward the journal, "this is too big for me." Clara's eyes caught the fading light. "Then maybe that's why you weren't meant to carry it alone." Her words settled into the air like a vow. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the presence of something larger than his own solitude. An ally. As evening crept over the valley, Clara rose to leave. Grace nickered softly, following her to the gate, and Rusty whined as though reluctant to let her go. Samuel walked her to the road, his boots crunching, in the gravel. "Be careful," he said. "The men who lit that fire will try again." Clara met his gaze squarely. "Then let them. I've lived my whole life under shadows cast by their kind. If it's time to face them, I won't run." Her figure grew smaller against the glow of town lanterns in the distance. Samuel lingered at the fence, watching until she vanished. Grace moved closer, pressing her muzzle against his shoulder. He stroked her neck absently, the unease in his chest tempered by a strange calm. In Clara Dawson, he had found more than a confidant. He had found proof that the story Grace carried in her bones wasn't meant for him alone. It was meant for those who had suffered, those whose families bore scars etched by greed and blood. The night darkened, but for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel entirely alone beneath it. The battle ahead was no less dangerous, yet now the path felt shared. And that, he realized, made all the difference. The morning after Clara Dawson's visit, the world felt different. Samuel Reed woke to the sound of Grace pawing at the corral, her hooves drumming a steady beat against the hard earth. It wasn't the nervous pacing of earlier nights. This was insistent, deliberate, like a summons. Rusty whined from the doorway, his one good eye flicking between Samuel and the mare as though urging him to pay attention. Samuel strapped on his boots and stepped into the yard. The air smelled of mesquite and dust, and a hawk circled overhead, its cry slicing through the quiet. Grace tossed her head toward the eastern hills, the same direction she had always watched. But this time she wheeled and stamped at the ground inside the corral. She was pointing to something closer. He crossed the fence, his hand brushing the rough wood, as if to ground himself. The mare backed away, leaving a patch of earth scuffed raw by her hooves. Samuel crouched, pressing his palm to the soil. It felt looser than the packed ground around it. He fetched a spade from the shed, then began to dig. Rusty barked once, sharp and uneasy, as clods of dirt gave way. The spade struck wood. Samuel froze, heart lurching. He cleared more soil until the outline of a small crate emerged, its boards rotted but intact enough to hold together. Pulling it free, he carried it to the porch. Grace nickered softly, almost approving, then returned to the fence line to stare toward the hills again. Inside the crate lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Samuel unwrapped it with careful hands, revealing a scatter of documents, faded letters, hand-drawn maps, and ledger sheets stamped with seals that had not been used in decades. He lifted one page and read aloud, voice low. Deposit records, withdrawals, names. His gut tightened. The names belonged to families he knew, some who had vanished generations ago, others whose descendants still walked the streets of Silver Creek, living quiet lives with no knowledge of what had been stolen from them. Among the papers was a letter written in hurried script. It spoke of betrayal, of a partner in the Blackwell family who had orchestrated not only robberies, but the murders of men meant to guard the shipments. Samuel's mouth went dry. It confirmed what the journal had hinted at. The Blackwells had built their foundation not on cattle or banking skill, but on orchestrated bloodshed. By the time Clara arrived that afternoon, the documents lay spread across the table beside the strongbox and the journal. She paused in the doorway, her eyes widening as she took in the evidence. "Lord above," she whispered, "this is enough to bury them." Samuel shook his head grimly. "Or enough to bury us." Clara crossed the room, lifting a ledger page. "Look at this. Widow's Pension Fund, orphanage construction, farm loans. These weren't just numbers, Sam. These were lives. Whole families stripped bare. If this comes to light, it won't just tarnish Richard Blackwell's name. It will turn Silver Creek inside out." Her words carried the weight of truth. Samuel knew the town leaned on the Blackwells' influence, for good or ill. Their ranch employed dozens. Their bank held nearly every deed. To expose them meant shaking the ground beneath every man, woman, and child in the territory. Rusty growled suddenly, ears pricked toward the ridge. Samuel rose and scanned the horizon. A rider moved along the skyline, silhouetted against the sun, too far to identify but close enough to remind him he was being watched. Clara stiffened at his side. "They know you found something," she said, "and they'll come looking." That night, Samuel locked the documents in a trunk beneath the floorboards, setting the journal atop them. He sat long into the hours with his rifle laid across his knees, lantern dimmed low. The silence outside was thick, broken only by Grace shifting in the corral and Rusty's occasional growl. His mind returned again and again to the names on those ledger pages. Faces rose with them. Men he had drunk with. Women he had seen laugh at Sunday socials. Children whose eyes carried echoes of those long dead. Their families had been living beneath lies for decades. Sleep eventually claimed him, but with it came dreams. He saw Grace limping across endless desert, leading him from one hidden grave to another. Each time she stamped the ground, gold spilled upward like water, and with it rose voices, pleading, angry, demanding justice. He woke slick with sweat, the image of Clara's pale face hovering in his mind. The following day, Clara returned with a determination sharper than before. "We can't keep this locked away, Sam. These aren't just secrets. They're chains. People deserve to know Samuel studied her, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. You put this out there, and the Blackwells won't just fight with lawyers or ledgers. They'll fight with guns." "Then let them," she said, her chin lifting. "For too long, people like them have thrived on fear." It's time someone pushed back. Grace stamped her hoof outside, as if seconding the claim. Rusty barked once, then settled at Clara's feet. Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew the road Clara spoke of had no return, but watching her, steady as a pillar in the fading light, he felt the faint stir of something he thought long buried. Hope. As dusk fell, he packed the documents into his saddlebag, tightening the straps with hands that trembled. Grace stood ready at the gate, eyes fixed eastward. Samuel understood then that the mare was not done with him. The canyon country still held more, and whatever lay ahead, the past would no longer stay buried. By the time Samuel Reed returned to Silver Creek with Clara Dawson at his side, the air in town had shifted. It was not just the heat rolling off the dust-blown streets, or the scent of manure drifting from the livery. It was the way conversations hushed when he passed, the way eyes followed him with curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Something about his presence, and the rumors that had begun to swell like summer thunderheads, had unsettled the town. The first sign came at the diner. Samuel pushed open the screen door, Rusty slipping in behind him, and found the room stiff with silence. Men who had been bent over their plates straightened, women set down forks mid-bite, and Mrs. Alvarez's hand froze over the coffee pot. Then the murmur of voices returned, louder than before, as if to cover what had been interrupted. He walked to his usual corner, sat down, and ordered nothing. Clara entered a moment later, her face set in calm resolve, and joined him. Whispers trailed between tables. Samuel caught fragments. That horse, a box, gold. He sipped water from the glass Mrs. Alvarez placed before him and kept his eyes fixed on the wall. Clara leaned forward and whispered, "They've heard enough to be dangerous. The story is out, even if no one knows the truth of it yet." After a tense meal, they stepped into the street. The sheriff stood on the opposite side, hands resting on his belt. His pale eyes studied Samuel with the calm scrutiny of a man weighing odds. He tipped his hat to Clara, but gave Samuel only a curt nod. That alone told Samuel what he needed. Law in Silver Creek had already begun to bend under the weight of the Blackwell name. The division became clearer over the next days. At the general store, Martha Hendress slipped an extra potato into Samuel's sack without charge and muttered, "Keep your head, Sam." Not everyone here's blind, but behind her, another customer muttered loud enough to be heard, "Crazy old soldier chasing ghosts." Two men laughed, their voices harsh, and Samuel felt his jaw tighten. In the saloon, where whiskey blurred more truths than it revealed, talk turned openly hostile. Ranch hands who owed wages to the Blackwell Ranch warned that Reed was stirring. Trouble best left buried. "You think Richard's gonna let some worn-out cowboy tear down his family's name?" one sneered, slamming a fist on the bar. "That fool's asking for an early grave." Yet in quiet corners, others leaned closer to whisper to Samuel when Clara wasn't near. "My grandfather lost his ranch after a robbery no one ever solved," one man confided. "If you've got proof, you best bring it to light." Another woman pressed a folded note into his palm, listing names of families who had carried debts passed down like curses, debts that tied back to the Blackwells. Hope flickered in their eyes, fragile as candle flame. The town was splitting along invisible lines, those who benefited from Blackwell wealth and those who had been crushed beneath it. Each side spoke louder, suspicion sharpening into anger. Samuel felt the shift most keenly at night. From his cabin porch, he could see lantern lights moving along the ridge, riders keeping watch. Once he heard the snap of a twig in the dark and raised his rifle, only to find a stray cow nosing through brush. Yet the sense of being hunted never left. Grace grew restless, pacing the corral until dawn, ears flicking at sounds too distant for Samuel to hear. Rusty barked into the night often, his voice ragged with warning. Clara urged him not to withdraw. "If you hide, they'll write you off as guilty before you speak," she insisted. So Samuel walked openly through town, shoulders squared, though his heart hammered. People either nodded to him with quiet respect or spat in the dirt as he passed. There was no longer any middle ground, One evening, the schoolhouse bell rang out, calling the townsfolk for a gathering. Clara had arranged it, though Samuel only learned after arriving. Families crowded the benches, their faces lined with suspicion, curiosity, or fear. Clara stood at the front, hands steady on the lectern, and spoke. "Many of you have heard rumors," she began, "about discoveries in the hills, about questions raised concerning the Blackwell fortune. I tell you now, those rumors carry truth, and if we choose silence, we choose chains for our children." Murmurs filled the room, some angry, some hopeful. Samuel felt all eyes on him when Clara motioned him forward. He set the journal on the table, opened it, and read a passage aloud. Details of a robbery, names of men murdered, a share of gold carried off and hidden. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush breath. Then Richard Blackwell himself entered, flanked by two of his hired men. His boots struck the wood floor with the confidence of a man who knew fear was his most valuable currency. "Enough of this nonsense," he said, voice smooth but edged. "My family built this town. You think I'll let some broken-down ranch hand and a school teacher drag our name through the mud? If you've got accusations, take them to the courts. Otherwise, shut your mouths before you tear this community apart." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, unwilling to challenge power. Others looked down, shame flickering in their eyes. Martha stood, arms crossed, and said firmly, "Maybe it's time the truth tore something apart." The room erupted. Shouts rang out, half defending the Blackwells, half demanding justice. The sheriff tried to restore order, but his words were drowned beneath the clash of voices. Samuel closed the journal and stepped back, heart pounding. He saw what Clara had feared. The town itself was cracking open, and once broken, it could never be mended the same way again. As he and Clara left under cover of night, Grace whinnied sharply from the corral, as though echoing the town's turmoil. Samuel looked once more at the lights of Silver Creek, flickering against the dark hills, and knew the division would not heal quietly. The Blackwells had ruled through silence and fear. Now, the silence was gone. The question was whether Silver Creek would survive the noise. The moon over Silver Creek rose pale and swollen, casting long shadows that stretched across the valley like dark fingers. Samuel Reed sat on his porch with the rifle laid across his knees, listening to the stillness. Grace shifted restlessly in the corral, her breath loud in the cool air. Rusty prowled the yard, hackles bristling, every few steps stopping to sniff and growl low in his throat. Samuel had learned long ago to trust the instincts of animals. Tonight, they told him trouble was near. The first sound came just past midnight, the faint crunch of boots on gravel where no one should have been walking. Samuel didn't move. He let the sound come closer, his finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. Rusty's growl deepened, his one eye fixed on the ridge. Grace tossed her head, her hoof striking the fence rail like a warning drum. Then a shadow broke from the tree line. A figure slipped across the yard, crouched low, moving toward the corral. Another followed, then a third, their shapes gliding with the caution of men who thought themselves hunters. Samuel rose silently, his boots making no sound on the porch boards. The rifle came to his shoulder, and his voice rang out sharp across the night. "That's far enough." The figures froze. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then one straightened slowly, showing empty hands. "Evening, Reed," the man said, voice low but mocking. "Heard you got yourself something don't belong to you. Thought we'd come help lighten your load. Samuel recognized him now. One of Richard Blackwell's hired hands, a ranch foreman known for his quick temper and quicker fists. The others lingered behind, eyes glinting in the moonlight, hands hovering near the revolvers strapped to their hips. "I've got nothing here for you," Samuel said. His voice was steady, though his heart thudded against his ribs. "Turn around and ride back to where you came from." The foreman chuckled. "Come now, old man. We both know you dug something out of those canyons. You think you can hide it from Richard? From the Blackwell family? Best hand it over before someone gets hurt." Samuel's rifle never wavered. "You step 1 inch closer, and you'll find out what hurt feels like." Rusty barked then, lunging forward, teeth bared. Grace reared against the fence, her limp forgotten, her eyes burning with wildfire. The sudden eruption broke the stalemate. One of the men reached for his pistol. Samuel squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the bullet striking the dirt a hand's breadth from the man's boot. Dust sprayed his leg. "Next one finds flesh," Samuel warned. The men faltered. The foreman's smirk faded, replaced by the cold calculation of someone weighing risk. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "You think this is over? You just drew your line, Reed, and the Blackwells don't forgive." He jerked his head toward the others, and together they melted back into the shadows, retreating toward the ridge where their horses waited. Samuel held his aim until the last hoofbeat faded into the night. Only then did he lower the rifle, shoulders tight with the knowledge of what he had just invited. The Blackwells would not stop. Tonight had been a test. The next time, they would come harder. Clara arrived at dawn, her eyes widening when she saw the churned earth and the burned lantern still hanging from the porch rail. Samuel told her what had happened in a few words. She listened, lips pressed thin, then touched the journal lying on the table inside. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said quietly. "They're coming because you have the truth. If we don't use it, they'll destroy you to bury it again." Her resolve pressed against his weariness. Samuel glanced through the window where Grace stood calm now, head lowered to the hay. She had carried him to the treasure, had stamped the ground until secrets rose. Now she seemed to wait for him to decide what to do with the weight she had placed in his hands. Rusty whined at the door, tail wagging, but ears pricked. The dog knew danger lingered just beyond the horizon. Samuel rubbed his face, feeling the grit of sleeplessness in his eyes. "I've fought wars, Clara," he said, "but this one's different. Back then, we knew the enemy. Now it's neighbors. Folks I've known my whole life." Clara laid a hand on his arm. "That's why it matters. If people like the Blackwells can twist the truth long enough, they'll make us all forget what justice looks like. Someone has to remind them." As the sun crested the hills, Samuel stepped outside once more. The valley lay bathed in golden light, but he felt the shadow of the night still clinging to his yard. He looked at Grace, at Rusty, at Clara standing firm despite the danger, and he knew the fight was no longer something he could put off. The Blackwells had drawn the first bloodless battle in the dark. The next would not end so quietly. The town of Silver Creek woke to another blistering morning, but Samuel Reed felt the heat in a different way. The encounter at his cabin still pressed against him like a bruise. The Blackwell men had come in the dark, testing his resolve, and though they left empty-handed, Samuel knew their next move would be bolder. Clara Dawson had been right. The journal and the documents could no longer remain hidden under his floorboards. The truth had to be dragged into the open, where shadows lost their power. Clara met him at the diner, her eyes sharp, her voice low. If the Blackwells will go as far as fire and threats, then there's more than money at stake. They're protecting something deeper. We need to know what Samuel studied her, the journal between them wrapped in a sackcloth. You're suggesting we go straight to their stronghold? She leaned closer. The bank. Where else would a family of thieves hide the bones of their past? Not in the open canyon where any man could stumble across it. They built their empire on lies, Sam, and empires like that keep their treasures close. The thought twisted in Samuel's gut. To break into the Blackwell Bank wasn't just reckless, it was suicide if they were caught. Yet Clara's words echoed the instinct stirring in him since Grace had led him to the first strongbox. The mare hadn't stopped pointing east, hadn't stopped stamping at unseen ground. She knew there was more. And now Clara's resolve mirrored the horse's persistence. Samuel's reluctance stood against two voices he couldn't ignore. That night, with the town shuttered against the desert wind, Samuel and Clara slipped into the square. Rusty padded silently at their heels, every sense on alert. Grace had been left behind at the cabin, her injured leg making stealth impossible, though Samuel felt her absence like a missing limb. Still, he carried the memory of her dark, insistent gaze as he approached the bank's heavy stone facade. The building loomed taller than anything else in Silver Creek, a monument to permanence. Its walls bore chisel marks from stonemasons long gone, and the iron bars across the windows gleamed in the moonlight. Samuel felt the weight of the town's debts pressing from within, as if every deed and mortgage were stored in the vault. Clara produced a set of skeleton keys she'd borrowed from an aging handyman who once worked for the Blackwells. "He doesn't trust them either," she whispered. "Said he'd rather these end up in honest hands than rust in his drawer." The key turned with a soft click, and the heavy door swung inward. They entered, lantern dimmed low, the air inside cooler and smelling faintly of ink and mildew. The main hall stretched before them, lined with teller windows and desks. It was quiet. Too quiet, the silence of money that had long since stopped belonging to those who earned it. Samuel moved toward the back, where the vault door stood, massive and unyielding. But Clara drew him toward a narrower stairwell descending below. "The Blackwells built this bank on the bones of something else," she said. "Look at the foundation. Older than the walls above. They used what was here before, and they buried their secrets in it." The stairs groaned under their weight. The basement smelled of damp stone, the kind of air that hadn't been disturbed in years. Their lantern flickered across crates stacked neatly against the walls, each marked with dates and numbers. Samuel pried one open with his knife. Inside lay bundles of paper, ledgers filled with lists of deposits, except the names were familiar. He traced his finger along the ink. Pension funds, orphanage accounts, family savings. The same names they'd seen in the canyon documents. Clara's breath caught. They never lost that gold. They stole it, laundered it through their own bank, and kept the ledgers to prove ownership. This isn't just theft, Sam. This is a cover so deep it swallowed generations. Samuel's hands shook as he lifted another ledger, heavier than the rest. Tucked inside its back cover was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He slit it open, revealing a letter written in a bold, steady hand. The words froze him where he stood. It was Jebediah Blackwell himself, writing to his heirs. In the letter, he confessed to orchestrating the robberies, naming the men he betrayed, justifying his actions as securing the future of the family. He instructed them to guard the truth with their lives, to bury any opposition, and to use fear to cement their legacy. Samuel closed his eyes, rage and sorrow warring in his chest. The Blackwell fortune was not merely born of theft. It was baptized in blood, preserved by intimidation, and handed down like an inheritance of sin. Before they could say more, Rusty growled, low and urgent. Samuel doused the lantern. Boots echoed above them, slow, deliberate steps. Someone else was in the bank. Samuel pressed Clara against the wall, rifle raised, listening as voices drifted down the stairwell. "Reed's been sniffing around," one man said. "Richard thinks he knows too much. If he finds what's down here—" The voice trailed off into curses. Another voice answered, colder. "Then we make sure he doesn't find anything again." The men descended halfway before Rusty barked sharply, his echo bouncing off the stone walls. Samuel fired once into the ceiling, the blast deafening in the confined space. Shouts erupted. Boots retreated. The intruders scrambled back up the stairs, doors slamming above. Clara exhaled, clutching her chest. Samuel lowered the rifle, ears ringing. "We need to get out before they circle back," he said. He stuffed the ledger and the letter into his coat, leaving the crates untouched. They slipped out through the back door into the night, hearts pounding, the town still asleep around them. The letter burned against Samuel's chest, like a brand. Proof of everything. Proof that the Blackwell Empire was nothing but rot and murder dressed in fine clothes. As they reached the edge of town, Grace's whinny carried faintly across the valley, though she was miles away. Samuel turned toward the sound, and for a moment he swore the mare's dark eyes looked back at him through the shadows, urging him onward. They had the truth now, but truth carried weight heavier than gold, and Samuel knew the Blackwells would do anything to silence it. Silver Creek stirred uneasily under the weight of secrets. By day, the streets looked the same. Horses tied to posts outside the saloon, wagons creaking under sacks of flour, children darting after one another in clouds of dust. But beneath it all, tension pressed like a storm about to break. Word of Samuel Reed's discoveries had spread, bent and reshaped by gossip, until no one knew where truth ended and rumor began. Some said he'd found a chest of outlaw gold. Others whispered of a journal that carried curses. Many believed the Blackwells themselves had been named in old crimes, though no one dared speak such accusations too loud in the daylight. It was Clara Dawson who decided the truth could not stay hidden in basements and back rooms. "We can't fight shadows with whispers," she told Samuel one evening as they sat at his table. "The whole town must hear it at once." In the open, where fear has less room to creep in. Samuel frowned at the idea, his rough hands tightening on the edge of the journal. "And if the Blackwells silence us before we finish speaking?" Clara's answer was simple. "Then at least Silver Creek will know what they tried to silence." The following Sunday, while townsfolk gathered at the whitewashed church for service, Clara slipped into the belfry. She rang the bell not once, not twice, but over and over, the iron tongue clanging until the sound thundered across the valley. Farmers dropped tools, shopkeepers left counters, ranch hands rode in from the edges of town. By the time Samuel and Clara stepped into the churchyard, nearly every soul in Silver Creek had gathered. Martha Hendris stood near the steps, apron dusted with flour. She caught Samuel's eye, gave a sharp nod, then raised her voice. "Folks, you better listen. There's something needs saying." The crowd murmured. Restless. Richard Blackwell appeared near the front with his men, his fine coat catching the sunlight, his face carved in a mask of calm disdain. Sheriff Dean hovered close to him, caught between duty and the pull of power. Clara mounted the steps, lifting her voice so it carried over the murmurs. "You've all heard rumors," she said, eyes sweeping the faces before her. "But today you'll hear the truth. Samuel Reed has uncovered records, ledgers, and letters that prove the Blackwell family's fortune was built not on honest banking, but on murder and theft." Gasps rose. Angry shouts followed. Richard Blackwell laughed, the sound brittle and mocking. Lies. Wild tales spun by a lonely old man and a woman who doesn't know her place. Do you really believe the Blackwells, who built your roads and kept this town alive, would stoop to crime? Samuel stepped forward, holding the leather-bound letter he'd taken from the bank's basement. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. "This is written by Jebediah Blackwell himself." His confession. His instructions to hide the truth and guard it with blood if necessary. "Read it for yourselves." He extended the paper. Martha snatched it before Richard could interfere, her flour-dusted hands trembling as she unfolded it. She read aloud, her voice breaking, but strong enough to reach the edges of the crowd. The words were damning. Admissions of robbery, betrayal of lawmen, vows to bury opposition. Each line peeled another layer from the Blackwell name until nothing remained but rot. The churchyard erupted. Some townsfolk shouted in anger, demanding justice. Others clung to denial, refusing to believe the family they had trusted could be guilty. The sheriff raised his hands for order, but his voice was drowned in the chaos. Then, in the midst of the uproar, Grace reared in her corral at the edge of town. Her cry carried across the square like a trumpet. Heads turned. Samuel and Clara followed the sound, leading the crowd with them. Grace stamped and pawed the ground near the church steps. Her injured leg forgotten, her blaze shining white against her sorrel coat. She struck the earth so hard the boards beneath the church porch rattled. Samuel felt the breath leave his chest. Clara gasped. Martha dropped the letter in shock, for Grace's stamping had revealed a hollow sound beneath the porch, a space long concealed. Men rushed forward, prying at the boards with crowbars and axes. Within minutes, the wood gave way, revealing a hidden chamber. Lanterns lowered into the gap revealed crates upon crates stacked beneath the church floor. Inside lay more gold coins, faded bank bags, and documents identical to those Samuel had found in the canyon and the bank cellar. Proof undeniable, stored not in some distant hideout, but beneath the very place where the town prayed. The crowd fell silent, the truth echoing louder than the bell Clara had rung. Richard Blackwell's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The sheriff stood frozen, his loyalty stripped bare in the face of evidence too heavy to ignore. Samuel placed a hand on Grace's neck, her body still trembling with the effort of her revelation. "Sometimes the ground itself remembers," he said softly. "And sometimes it takes more than men to uncover what's been buried too long." The bell of the church swung once more in the evening wind, its tone deep and mournful. Silver Creek would never be the same. The silence that followed the discovery beneath the church was heavier than gunfire. Every face in the square bore the weight of revelation. Neighbors staring at neighbors, trust cracking like dry earth under summer heat. For decades, Silver Creek had leaned on the Blackwell fortune, built schools and roads under its shadow. Now that shadow stretched darker than anyone had dared to imagine. Richard Blackwell tried first to bluster his way out. He shoved through the crowd, his polished boots grinding dust into the cracks of the church steps. "Fabrications," he shouted, his voice hoarse but straining to command. "Planted evidence. Tricks by a bitter old man and his pet schoolteacher. You fools will tear this town apart believing in ghosts." But no one moved. Martha Hendris held the confession letter high for all to see, her flower-streaked hand steady. The lanterns revealed more than words. Stamped bank bags marked with emblems no one had seen since their grandparents' time. Coins stamped with years tied to robberies long whispered about. A truth too heavy to spin into lies. From the back of the crowd, a man's voice rose, cracked with age. "My father rode with the posse that chased down those bandits. He was shot in the back. We buried him with no justice, and now I see who profited from it." His words cut like a blade. Murmurs spread, anger bubbling into shouts. The sheriff raised his hands, but his face betrayed his turmoil. His family owed its farm to Blackwell loans. His children were fed with wages Blackwell men paid. To turn against them now would be to bite the hand that had kept them alive. Yet the evidence lay before him, undeniable. Richard's hired men, sensing the swell of fury, closed ranks around him, hands on their pistols. The crowd recoiled, some grabbing their children, others standing taller in defiance. Clara Dawson stepped forward, her voice sharp enough to cut through the din. "This is not about vengeance. This is about truth. Will you allow fear to rule you, or will you demand justice?" Her words steadied some, but the division only deepened. Families who depended on Blackwell coin shouted back. "And what then? Tear down the bank and starve us all?" A woman clutched her husband's arm, fear sharpening her tone. "Without the Blackwells, Silver Creek is nothing but dust." The crowd fractured into shouting factions, and in that moment Samuel Reed saw how fragile a town could be when truth pressed too hard against its walls. He felt the journal heavy in his coat pocket, the ledger pages burning like coals. These were not mere records. They were matches waiting to set the whole valley ablaze. Then Grace screamed. Her cry split the uproar, shrill and raw, louder than the bell Clara had rung earlier. Every head turned. The mare stood wild-eyed at the edge of the square, mane whipping, her injured leg trembling but unbowed. She reared high, striking the sky, and when her hooves struck earth again, the sound echoed like thunder. For an instant, the town froze. In the hush that followed, an old rancher near the front spoke, voice low but carrying. "I remember stories about a sorrel mare with a white blaze, rode with the Blackwell gang in the early days. They said she vanished after the killings. Folks swore the ghost of that horse would come back when the truth finally clawed its way out." His eyes fixed on Grace, wide with awe. "Looks like the past has teeth after all." The murmur became a roar. People surged forward, some to touch the crates of gold, others to confront Richard directly. His men drew their guns, and the crowd scattered back in fear. Samuel's hand shot to his rifle, heart pounding. Bloodshed was one misstep away. Clara gripped his arm. "Don't!" Not yet. Richard's voice cracked as he shouted above the chaos, desperate now. "You think a crippled horse and a pile of old paper will undo my family? You'll regret this day, all of you." His fury bled into his men, who brandished their weapons with wild eyes. But something in the crowd had shifted. Fear no longer held absolute sway. Men and women who had been quiet too long found their voices. Shouts rose, demanding arrests, demanding restitution. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers. Old men spat in the dirt at Richard's feet. The sheriff stood caught in the middle, sweat dripping down his brow. For one heartbeat, Samuel thought he would side with Blackwell out of habit. But then the lawman's gaze dropped to the crates beneath the church, to the confession letter still held high in Martha's hand, to the faces of townsfolk he had sworn to protect. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand on his revolver, not to draw, but to rest it on the grip as a sign of choice. The crowd fell silent again, waiting. The air itself seemed brittle, ready to shatter. And then, as if on cue, Grace stepped forward into the center of the square. She limped, but held her head high, eyes burning with a strange clarity. She stood between Samuel and Richard, between the people and the guns, and stamped once on the earth. The sound reverberated like a gavel. The shattering moment had come. The town of Silver Creek would never return to what it had been, and every soul present knew it. The town square still trembled with the echoes of Grace's stamping hooves when the shouting finally collapsed into a tense, brittle silence. Faces flushed with anger, others drained pale with fear. All turned toward Richard Blackwell, whose name had carried weight for generations and now hung poisoned in the air. The crates beneath the church porch lay open, their contents undeniable, their gold and ledgers glittering like accusations under the lantern light. Richard's men stood with pistols half raised, sweat shining on their brows, but none dared fire first. For a moment the stalemate balanced on a knife's edge, Silver Creek suspended between history and reckoning. Then Sheriff Dean drew his revolver with slow precision and pointed it, not at Samuel, not at the crowd, but squarely at Richard Blackwell. "Put your guns down," he ordered, his voice loud enough to cut through the heavy quiet. "This town deserves the truth, and I won't see it silenced tonight." The crowd gasped. The sheriff had been seen for years as pliable, a man too willing to bend under Blackwell power. Now he stood like a pillar, choosing a side with his weapon. Richard's eyes widened, his voice trembling with fury. "You dare betray me, Dean? After all my family's done for you? Done for me?" The sheriff's voice cracked with something close to grief. "Your family chained us in debt, took land from men better than you'll ever be, and bled this town dry. Tonight it ends." Richard lunged, his hand flashing toward his coat, but Samuel was faster. His rifle barked once, the bullet striking the ground inches from Richard's boot, throwing up a spray of dust. The message was clear. One more move, and the next shot would not miss. The crowd surged then, voices rising like a tide. Some shouted for Richard's arrest. Others wept openly, as if decades of silence had finally burst. Martha Hendris stepped forward, holding the confession letter high, her flower-streaked hand glowing pale in the lantern light. "You built your empire on the backs of widows and children," she cried. "You robbed this town of fathers, of sons." "That's the only legacy you own." Richard's men faltered, eyes darting between the furious crowd and the sheriff's steady aim. One by one, they lowered their guns, shame carved into their faces. Richard, abandoned, staggered back against the church wall, his fine coat streaked with dust. And in the chaos, Grace let out a sound that silenced all once more. It was not the sharp cry of a startled horse, but a deep, trembling groan. She swayed where she stood, her legs buckling. Samuel's chest seized. He dropped the rifle and rushed to her side as she sank to her knees in the dust. "No," Samuel whispered, his hands cradling her head. "Not now. Not after all this." Her eyes, dark and endless, found his. She breathed hard, each exhale rattling through her thin frame. The crowd parted, their fury dissolving into collective awe and sorrow. Clara knelt beside them, her hand on Grace's neck. "She's carried the weight too long, Sam." Maybe this was her last gift. Samuel pressed his forehead against the mare's blaze, tears streaking the dust on his cheeks. "You brought me the truth. You brought it to all of us." His voice cracked. "Rest, girl. Rest." Grace exhaled one final time, a sound like wind slipping out of a canyon, and then her body stilled. The silence that followed was sacred. For years, the town had lived under the hush of buried crimes, but now this silence was different. It was reverence. It was grief. It was release. Samuel rose slowly, his hands stained with dust and tears. He turned to face the crowd. "She gave her life to carry us here, to show us what we refuse to see. Now, it's on us to decide what we'll do with the truth." Richard Blackwell tried to speak, but the sheriff's hand clamped his shoulder, steel and authority in the grip. "You'll answer for this," Dean said flatly. "Every last word in that journal, every coin in those crates." He marched Richard forward, the once proud man stumbling as jeers and curses followed him. The townsfolk gathered around Grace's still body, some kneeling to touch her, others weeping openly. Children clutched their mother's skirts, their wide eyes reflecting lantern light. Samuel stood apart, heart broken but unbowed, knowing the price of truth had been exacted in flesh and spirit. Clara touched his arm gently. "She won't be forgotten." "No," Samuel murmured. "She's part of this town now. As much as the dust, as much as the river. Her name will live longer than theirs ever did." The bell of the church tolled once in the distance, swung by unseen hands. Its sound was low, mournful, but not hopeless. It was the sound of an ending, and the fragile beginning that followed. The truth had been freed, but freedom always came at a cost. The days that followed moved like a slow river through Silver Creek, carrying away what once was and leaving behind a town forever changed. Richard Blackwell sat in the county jail under armed guard, stripped of his swagger, his name now whispered not with reverence, but with contempt. The sheriff rode to Santa Fe with the confession letter, the ledgers, and crates of stolen gold, determined that the law outside the valley would weigh the Blackwell crimes. For the first time in living memory, the family's grip on the town loosened. But Silver Creek did not celebrate with fireworks or parades. Instead, it grieved. At the edge of town, on a sunburnt hill where cottonwoods bent in the wind, Samuel Reed and Clara Dawson oversaw a simple burial. Grace lay beneath a mound of red earth, her body wrapped in coarse cloth, her blaze of white hidden now, but never forgotten. A rough-hewn marker stood at the head of the grave, carved by Samuel's own hand. It read, "Grace, the horse that carried truth through time." The whole town came, farmers, merchants, mothers and children. People who had shouted at one another days before now stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads in silence. Even those who had once defended the Blackwells found themselves moved to pay respect. They understood, perhaps dimly, that the horse had been more than an animal. She had been a vessel for the truth they'd all feared, a bridge between what was buried and what demanded to be spoken. Samuel stood apart, hat in hand, his face carved with sorrow. Rusty sat faithfully beside him, ears low, his one good eye fixed on the mound of earth. Clara joined Samuel, her hand slipping into his, not out of pity, but solidarity. "She gave us more than gold, Sam," she whispered. "She gave us back our voices." After the burial, the townsfolk lingered. Martha Hendress placed a basket of wildflowers at the grave. Children, sensing something sacred, laid small stones atop the mound as tokens of thanks. An old rancher began to hum a hymn, low and steady, and soon others joined, their voices weaving through the wind. It wasn't planned. It rose from grief and gratitude alike. In the weeks that followed, Silver Creek began to stitch itself back together. The stolen wealth, once catalogued by lawmen, was ordered to be returned where possible. Families long burdened by debts found their land freed. The orphanage, neglected for years, received funds to rebuild. The scars would not vanish overnight, but hope crept back into the valley, tentative as dawn. For Samuel, life did not resume as before. The cabin felt emptier without Grace's restless hooves in the corral. Each morning he found himself glancing toward the fence, expecting her gaze fixed eastward, waiting to lead him again. The silence cut deeper than he cared to admit. Yet something within him had shifted. Where loneliness once hollowed him, now memory filled the space. Grace had carried him out of solitude, into a fight larger than himself, and though she was gone, the weight of her gift remained. Clara visited often. She brought books for Samuel, convinced his rough hands could manage more than tools, that he could carry history forward with words as well as actions. Sometimes she brought her fiddle, playing soft tunes on the porch while Rusty slept, and Samuel listened with eyes closed. Between them, something unspoken grew, not born of romance alone, but of shared scars and resilience. One evening, as the sun bled across the mesas, Samuel and Clara walked to the hill where Grace lay. The wind carried the scent of sage, and the horizon burned gold. They stood before the marker, and Samuel placed his calloused hand against the wood. "I spent years thinking I had nothing left," he said quietly. "But she showed me otherwise. She showed me I still had a place in this world." Clara's eyes glistened. "She showed all of us, Sam." As dusk fell, lanterns appeared one by one along the main street of Silver Creek. Families gathered outside, telling stories, not just of crimes and reckonings, but of Grace. They spoke of the lame horse who had stamped at the ground until buried truths rose, who had walked with pride despite her brokenness. They told their children that strength did not always come from power or wealth, but sometimes from the most fragile-looking creatures who refused to give up. In time, her legend grew. Travelers passing through heard of the horse that toppled a dynasty, and they carried the tale to other towns. Writers scribbled versions of it in newspapers, embellished and twisted, but always keeping her name: Grace. Samuel returned often to the hill. Rusty aged at his side, his muzzle whitening, his steps slower. Together they kept vigil. Samuel never spoke of miracles, but when he looked out, across the desert, he felt the faintest echo of hooves in the wind. He chose to believe that Grace still ran somewhere beyond the horizon, free of pain, carrying the truth she had unearthed into eternity. On the first anniversary of her passing, the town gathered again. A stone marker replaced the wooden one, chiseled with words agreed upon by all. Here rests Grace, who gave her last breath so Silver Creek could breathe again. Children placed flowers, elders bowed heads, and Samuel, standing at the front, felt tears rise unashamed. He turned to Clara, his voice rough but certain. "She changed us." Clara squeezed his arm gently. "She saved us." As twilight deepened, the church bell rang. Not in warning, not in mourning, but in remembrance, its toll rolled across the valley, steady and sure. And Samuel Reed, once the loneliest man in Silver Creek, stood among his people. Not alone, but bound forever to the memory of a lame sorrel mare with a blaze of white, who had carried a broken man and an entire town to the truth. And now, I want to hear from you. If Grace's story touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments, just to let me know you're here. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the bond between people and animals. Tales that will break your heart, then heal it again.